Kyle Waters works as a software engineering manager. He lives here in Draper and has been a member of our club and Toastmasters since January. Already given us a couple of speeches. Today's speech will be from Pathways Leadership, or Dynamic Leadership, and will be his research and presenting project. The speech is titled A Little Speech About Draper.
Kyle Waters.
Thank you, Toastmasters. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming out here to listen to me today. How many of you live here in Draper? So yeah, several of you. I live here in Draper. I moved here 7 years ago. And being interested in history, as I've mentioned before, I always have questions when I move to a new place. You know, how did it get its name? What's this deal with Fort Street? What's with that really old school? So I went to the library and found some books conveniently for me. The Draper Historical Society in the 90s put together a collection of stories of people who had lived here and their histories. They also have an overarching, volume 2 is an overarching history of Draper, so I was able to look up some of this information. Originally this area was called Willows or South Willow by the pioneer settlers. But when they decided they wanted a post office, they submitted to have a post office named after the first settler and kind of a leader in the town, Ebenezer Brown. But they were told they couldn't have Brownsville because at the time Ogden was going by the name of Brownsville, and you can't have two post offices in the same territory with the same name because they won't know where anything's supposed to go. So they decided to try again, and this time they took another early settler, William Draper III, who was also a church leader. They often call him the, first presiding elder, so he's kind of like what I think would now call a branch president. He wasn't technically the bishop of the area. And so they called it Draperville, and it was the Draperville post office. William Draper III ended up moving on and settling other areas in the state pretty quickly. The Browns stayed. Ebenezer Brown actually became the official postmaster while his wife did most of the work because she could actually read and write and he couldn't. They made him the postmaster. So they stayed in the area a while. They actually contributed some of their land to build a fort because they were concerned about the Native Americans. So they were building this fort. Then their relationships with the federal government got acrimonious. So they decided to make the fort bigger and better, which actually led to them never getting it done. I don't know how far they ever got done. We don't have any evidence left, but they never really enclosed this fort. But if you've ever been over to the Draper Historical Park, you know where they talk about that. This is where the fort was. It actually included the park, the block the park's on, as well as across the street from the park. So those buildings that were across the street on all four sides. So those streets were inside the fort, and that block was the central block inside the fort, and then there were houses around the outsides of the streets, and then the walls around those buildings. That area did end up getting, it was kind of the downtown of Draper, and it did end up getting settled, and people built houses there, and they'd often live in those houses during the winter when there wasn't a reason to be out on their farm, and they could be closer to everyone, and it was kind of the central area for the town. They had the church was of course there, and so they'd meet there at the church. Not only did they meet there for church services, the kids would go to school there in that church. And at first, local residents would teach at that school, would teach the students. But eventually one day a stranger wandered into town. He was from Ohio, and he was on his way to see his brothers in California. He was going to move out there and try to find his fame and fortune out there. And he got to Salt Lake, and accounts vary. Some say he just ran out of money and he needed more money, and and it was cold, it was winter, he didn't want to travel. So he was going to stay here and work the winter and get enough money to go to California. Other reports say part of it was curiosity about the Mormons and the church and wanting to learn some stuff there. And he just apparently started wandering down Main Street looking for work. And he got all the way to Draper and found a farmer was there, and he said, "Hey, I need some work. Do you have any farm work I can do?" And the farmer's like, "It's fall. I don't really have farm work. If you want to stay for a while, I can take care of you. You're welcome to stay." He said, "Well, I'd really like to earn my living." "Okay, here, you can shuck some corn." So he has him shucking corn, and they got talking, and he learns, you're clearly well-read and educated, and we need a teacher. Would you like to be our teacher here in Draperville? And so John Rocky Park says, yeah, sure, I'll go ahead and give that a try. And he stays the winter and teaches, ends up staying a couple years, and says, I'm not really sure I'm sold on this whole thing, staying here in Utah and being Mormon, so I'm going to go to Oregon. So he goes to Oregon, runs a business for a couple years, and decided he was sold on the idea of staying here in Draper. And so he comes back, teaches for a couple more years, and he gets kind of recognized for being a really good teacher. And Draper has one of the best teachers. And so when the University of Deseret gets organized, he gets asked to be the president of the University of Deseret. So he moves on, becomes the president of the University of Deseret. Draper finds new teachers. They eventually start building some more schools. They build the center, what they call the Central School, and use that for a while, build a couple smaller schools, and they decide to consolidate. So they expand and renovate the Central School in about 1898. At this point, John Parker has been elected the first superintendent of public schools for the state of Utah, so they named their new school, really expanded and renovated and mostly built in 1898, the John Parks School. So thank you everyone for coming out to my presentation. I hope you found some of that stuff is interesting to me about the name and the origin of the Fort Street and the Park School. Thank you. Thank you, Toastmaster.